Thanks for joining us for this conversation following our screening of episodes 1 and 2 of the tremendous docuseries Last Call, When a Serial Killer Stalked Queer New York. And remember to watch new episodes of Last Call on HBO, Sundays at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and stream on Max. Now it's my honor to introduce the esteemed panelists and moderators for this post-screening panel. So please join me in welcoming the following. We have Director of Last Call, Anthony Corona.
Hi.
We have the Executive Producer of Last Call, Howard Gertler.
Hello.
We have the Executive Director of New York City Anti-Violence Project, Beverly Tillery.
Hello.
We have the former Director of Client Services at the New York City Anti-Violence Project, Bea Hansen.
Hi all.
And then, of course, we have our moderators for this conversation, co-hosts and co-executive producers of Gay USA, Ann Northrup and Andy Hum.
Hello.
Hi, Nick.
So, Last Call. It's a book by Elon Green, who also worked with you on this production, about this case that took place mostly 30 years ago, in some cases more, about someone who was picking up gay men in New York bars and killing and dismembering them. The police seemed to be either stymied or, in the case of the NYPD, indifferent or hostile. And then the Anti-Violence Project worked to change that, and the story unfolds in this gripping series. So Anthony and Howard, why were you drawn to this story, which came out in about 2021, I think? And what did you hope to accomplish by telling this story at this point?
I think that, you know, I actually told this story last night at the premiere, and I've told it a couple times, but I got the manuscript for the book in 2020, and I was asked to direct it as a documentary, and I passed on it after reading it because I wasn't that interested in true crime, and I also was very afraid of re-victimizing the community and all of the implications that come with telling a story like this. And then almost exactly a year later, Howard asked me to dinner and said that he was thinking about working on this book called Last Call, and that he had read it, and he saw that there was an opportunity to tell an activist story and a social justice story, and rereading it through that lens, it was immediately clear to me that was like, it was an incredible opportunity to actually do that and sort of use true crime as this Trojan horse of sorts to get in a much deeper conversation about the anti-gay violence movement.
And you talked to the cops involved, you humanize the victims, you talk to their families and friends of the victims, you talk to the activists and the journalists. So how hard was it I was amazed watching it. How did you get all these people on camera and to, talk so openly about it?
Howard, you take that one.
Sure. First of all, I just want to say it's such an honor. I feel like we are living the dream of like being on an episode of Gay USA.
I know.
So Ann and Andy, thank you so much. And to be in conversation here with you, Bev, and Bea all together is really special. And we appreciate NewFest providing us with this opportunity. And the first part of, as part of your sort of development and pre-production period on a documentary, you spend time just doing outreach to potential subjects, cultivating the subjects, having a number of conversations where you clarify what your intent is, why you're making the show, why you want to interview someone. And ultimately, when we conduct these interviews, in many cases, and I think, Bea and Andy, since you sat for interviews with us, you could also speak to that, is what do you as a subject want to get out of the process? How is the process useful to you? Very often we do want the subjects to guide the conversations to a certain extent. Mm-hmm. And I felt like what was gratifying for us as filmmakers is that, especially for people who suffered a lot of personal pain as a result of these crimes, the process of participating in the show ended up being very cathartic. some of the folks were talking about this experience for the very first time, or the very first time on camera.
Well, let's follow what Howard just said. What did you intend to get out of this? This was 30 years ago for you. How much was it still in the front of your mind, and what did you expect to get from doing this series?
Yeah, 30 years ago there were a lot of cobwebs I had to kind of pull away, in terms of like some of the specifics. But I think to Anthony's point, and I really appreciate Anthony and Howard's perspective on it, that they really wanted to be focused on the activism in the community and the impact, and not a true crime story in that kind of traditional way. I've been approached, and there's been other violent things that happen in the queer community in New York City that have been the subjects of true crime episodes, and very much focused on the violence and the crime, and not about the impact on community, the mobilization of community, the heart of community. And that's really what I liked about it. And I feel like it also showed the kind of mobilization that was happening at that time. We have ongoing mobilization, now around violence against the queer community, and really just shows that, and provides an opportunity to really talk about the impact on the community and how the community takes care of itself in a I think felt like a really honest way.
And Beverly, Matt Foreman spoke at the screening last night and said some of the infrastructure of anti-violence projects around the country is not as robust as it was then. I don't know how you feel about that, because you're still doing it here in New York. How are things better or worse in terms of anti-LGBTQ violence and in terms of dealing with the police?
Whoa, you've asked a bit of a mouthful there. Let me try to bite off some of it. I would agree with Matt Foreman, unfortunately, around the state of the infrastructure of the anti-violence organizations, the organizations that are doing the direct work on the ground to support survivors day in and day out, to advocate for what survivors need, that do that organizing work. It is true that these groups across the country have had a hard time over the last few years, especially through COVID. But I think in general, it's been hard for some organizations to sustain themselves. As some of you all may know, AVP in New York City staffs and supports the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs, which is a network of about over 40 of those organizations across the country. Some of these groups are really tiny, and they were under-resourced already, and it's hard for them to sustain funding and support. And in a lot of cases, the best way that they can get funding is through government, and that funding is challenging for a number of reasons and limiting. So we could have a whole conversation just about that. I want to try to answer your question about the state of violence, because we're seeing violence from all ends and all sides. You can't have this conversation without acknowledging and talking about the crisis of violence and homicides towards trans women, Black trans women especially, in this country. We've had an ongoing sort of community dialogue of counting and naming these names, but this has been an endless and just a never-ending, it seems, crisis in our community. And last year, for example, we tracked at least 38 homicides of trans folks. 2/3 of those were Black trans folks, many of them Black trans women. So you have that crisis. In New York City, we've been seeing recently instances of very similar targeted attacks aimed at gay men attending bars in Hell's Kitchen. That has been a new crisis that we have been responding to as a community, and people have been responding by, doing a lot of canvassing and support out in the streets, really trying to get information out to community, working with the bars in our community to make sure that they can continue to be safe spaces. We have the targeted political violence that we are all dealing with, particularly the anti-trans laws that are passing across the country. We have continued police violence, and we're seeing more police violence in response to protests and gatherings of LGBTQ community members. And I also just want to uplift, AVP just did a study of LGBTQ safe spaces across the country, where we surveyed almost 400 bars and community centers and bookstores and nightclubs and health centers and all those places that that came out of this movement in the 80s and the 90s, designed to really make our communities safe, and all of these places that are safe havens for our community, and they are under attack. And so we have this report that's about to come out that will show and talk about the ways that we are seeing those attacks, from protests to vandalism to other kinds of attacks in and outside of spaces, to threats against the folks who are running those spaces. So we're being hit on a number of different fronts. And, B talked about that community trauma. That community trauma is very expansive right now, and it is long lasting. So, as a community, we have to deal with we've been in crisis now for many, many years, and we continue to be in crisis to try to respond to all of the violence that's happening. And we also have to think about the collective trauma that our community is undergoing, and how do we meet the needs of a community that is always being targeted.
Well, given what you've just said about the escalating onslaught of attacks from all sides and to many parts of our communities, and the under-resourcing of our institutions, I'm curious about where we stand. I've been the subject of and seen a lot of attacks by the police on demonstrators, but we see in the series, Last Call, the ignorance and reluctance of the police. Has that evolved at all? Or in your experience, is there any difference in the way police departments respond these days?
There's some. I think it varies really, from place to place, from community to community, and unfortunately from officer to officer. What I will say is that consistently, when we poll individuals, and now in our survey of groups, we're seeing about half of folks are trying to engage the police and want to go to the police and asking for help. And about half of the folks are saying, no, we're not going to go to police. We don't have trust. We believe that we are going to be further harmed. We have experienced being further harmed. So I think both realities are true. I think that there have been efforts, because of what community has done, to institute things like LGBTQ police liaisons, which sometimes make people feel safer, and for there to be some training and more dialogue. So I can't say there hasn't been any change, but what I will say is, in terms of systemic, overarching change and commitment from the leadership level of police departments across the country, I don't see that we feel like there is a commitment to real accountability in terms of making sure that police officers who are not meeting the community's needs, who are not treating community members respectfully, who are harming community, are really held accountable. And that lack of accountability and commitment from the higher ups of police departments makes it hard to see long-term change. One interesting thing from the study that we just did on safe spaces that we're finding is we asked people, did you report to the police? If not, why? And about 19% of the groups that did not report to the police have told us that the reason that they didn't report to the police is in their local community that they see the police as aligned with white nationalist groups and anti-LGBTQ hate groups. So that is also a different reality that we are seeing rising, where not only are white nationalist groups more visible, but it seems like police in some areas are more emboldened to be, affiliated with these groups. And that is a huge problem.
And yet we don't seem to know too much about this killer because he won't talk. He didn't talk to you, Anthony and Howard. But they're not all the same. Some of them were from the townhouse in the Five Oaks. One was a street hustler. But the interesting thing is that their family and friends loved them and did speak up, I believe, B at the time. And, that made a hell of a difference, even though it took a long time to solve the crime.
Yeah, B, you could probably speak to that because I feel like you had interaction with either the families within our story or even families that were, outside of our story,
Yeah, I mean, I think, in the story, we had very little connection with Peter Anderson and Tom Mulcahy's family. And I think a lot of it is because they were not out and were fairly closeted. I think, we had much more, and Anthony Marrero, because he was a street hustler, as you say, and I think it was hard to find people who would really want to talk to really anybody about him. I think there was at that time, and I don't know how much has changed, but people who were doing sex work were very much targeted by law enforcement and by other people, that there was just, I think, a real sense of kind of being in your with your own people. And it was when Michael Sakara was killed that it felt like it really galvanized the community, because it was really the heart of where the queer community at that time, the gay male community, particularly in the West Village and Chelsea, congregated, and because he was known and he was out. I think we, at that time in the 90s, I think we struggled a lot with having any connections with survivors, family members who weren't also queer, who weren't their partner, or who weren't, their queer family. Having people's kind of their, biological family, wherever, wasn't somebody that weren't people who we generally spoke to. And I think it's a lot of times because people, even if they were out, they had some estrangement from their family often. So it was hard for us to have a lot of family connection. I don't know if that's changed over the years, but that was definitely what happened in the 90s.
Oh yeah, we see families now really standing by their kids when they're beat up and things. I mean, there was a woman who lost her son took his own life, and she insisted on, in this small Texas town, that we have a pride proclamation, and the mayor did it. But let's go back to, with Anthony and Howard, to putting this thing together and putting it all together. You really did a lot of strong archival research from mainstream media and a deep dive into the KUSA archive. What went into that, and what were you looking for?
Can I just talk to one thing that B said really quickly, and Bev said really quickly, in terms of victims being uncomfortable with going to the police. This is something we do illuminate in the show. In the second episode, we have that one person who did not want to show his face in the interview for various reasons, and talked about being assaulted by someone whose methodologies were very similar to this killer's, and we presume was probably the killer, and he escaped.
And
but
before you say, I have to say, Thomas Mulcahy's wife was on the police to do.
Yeah, she was advocating for sure, and the whole family. But this other guy, he told a longer story, which, time limitations with this show, there was so much more we wanted to be able to do and say. He was a victim of domestic abuse prior to the incident that he talks about in the show, and he went to the police and they didn't take it seriously. And I think you talked about this, and Matt talked about this, and Andy, I'm sure you talked about this as well, is, in circumstances of domestic abuse, you go to the police and they say it's a lover's quarrel. They don't take it seriously. And so something like this happens where he's assaulted by someone he's picked up in, he's someone who picks him up in a bar, may have drugged him in the bar. And we say, well, did you go to the police? And he was like, what are they going to do? Nothing. The reason he says this, I think, speaks to both Bev and B, what you've been talking about, which is a phenomenon that people are still, in many communities are still dealing with today in terms of policing. And, we can't take for granted that a wide audience is going to understand that series of circumstances. And we're hoping the storytelling to sort of guide them to that. In terms of the archival, what we really wanted to do is visualize the story that Elon told in the book, but also bring our audiences into the world of the 80s and 90s and into the queer world. And it's something that we did, How to Survive a Plague. It was told almost entirely, we had some of the interviews that David conducted in the present day, but it was mostly composed of archival. So we tried to do that as much as possible. We realized there was a Gay USA episode for everything. And everybody was on Gay USA, like all of our subjects. B, obviously you were on it multiple times, as was Matt, like every character. And, we had, amazing archival producers, Rebecca Stern and Rosemary Rotondi. And we would get to a story point and we'd say, hey, like, can you go look in, I think it's Fales where the archive is held. Can you see if so-and-so was there? Edgar Rodriguez was on it. There was so much that was on there, so much that didn't make its way into the show. And a lot that we utilized even as sort of background research. And so, what our archival producers did is they went into Fales. They went into a bunch of institutions that hold, great LGBTQIA collections. We also discovered that WNBC News really followed the case when the arrest happened. And onwards. But something that we also wanted to sort of compare and contrast is the way queer-led community media, Gay USA, Duncan Osborne, The Advocate, Gay City News, etc., covered the murders in the way that the mainstream media wasn't doing, in the lead up to the arrest, and then of course also from the arrest afterwards. And I think just that alone explains or illuminates what the atmosphere was like during that time period.
And B, what's your observation of the role that mainstream media played in a bad way in this, or a good way? But did they, over sensationalize things? Did they ignore things? Did they take an unsophisticated view? My bias is showing here, but
all true. I would have the same biases in terms of looking at the news. I mean, we got that with basically every time there was some sort of violence against the LGBT community, it was kind of a blame game. This last call killer idea came from an article by Mike McAlery, who had a huge vendetta, I would say, against the queer community by being very blaming of this idea of this last call killer, that it's somebody who, is desperate to go home with somebody. They'll even go home with somebody who's going to kill them. He was the same person that wrote an article about a Black lesbian who was raped in Prospect Park and say that she lied because she was part of an activist organization and a rally that weekend. So he was particularly bad. But in general, we got either zero coverage or some sort of blaming coverage, or like a teeny weeny little article that was also blaming in it, and so that's why it was super helpful to have people like Duncan Osborne. There were some decent articles that were written by a few people, like David Dunlap in the New York Times did a couple of good articles, because out of this
Gay reporter. Gay reporter, yes.
Yes, exactly. A gay reporter, of course, who really took it on. And this wasn't even his beat at all. He had a whole different beat, but he took this on. And it was when out of these serial murders and some other murders that were happening about the same time, we started a whole report on homicides, gay-related homicides and queer-related homicides around the country. And he reported on that and had a huge spread in the Times that was really helpful, and actually launched the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs that Bev mentioned earlier.
Now, before we run out of time, Beverly, I hope you will give us the 1 minute take on how we can protect ourselves against pickup crimes.
Sound. You're muted. You're muted, Bev.
Yeah. No, there you go.
Okay, here we go. So first, I will say, just be aware that they're still happening. It hasn't stopped. When we've been doing some of the street outreach and education out in community recently, the pickup crimes do look a little bit different now. We have apps, we have Grindr, we have lots of tools at our disposal. And so we have some safety tips for folks that, one, make a plan before you go out. Make sure you are in communication with people that you trust and let them know where you're going to be and how you're going to communicate, so that you have somebody who always has your back. Make sure that you are paying attention, as always, to your drinks, what people are putting in it. And, a new tip that we're having people just really pay attention to is, what we've seen in the Hell's Kitchen attacks recently is that there's been an element of robbery connected with the attacks, and people are accessing folks' accounts through their phones. And, so many people now, we're told that, using your face recognition and other features can be safer. And that is true. And in these cases, it can also be used against you. What we were seeing is people are using that tool as a way to, once they've drugged someone, get into their phones, access their accounts, and drain those accounts. So just be aware of how people are using technology now, pay attention to it, and think about ways that you can use technology to help you. There are lots of ways that people are connecting and setting up support systems with their friends and networks so that they're looking out for each other and using technology to do that, using video to take pictures of where you're at and just track who you're with even. So, we have more safety tips on our website, so people can go to avp.org to get more safety tips. And if people are interested in joining a team to learn more or to do some more education about safety, to volunteer, particularly in New York City and around the country, we are doing a lot of upstander trainings for both hate violence prevention and also intimate partner violence prevention. And we're giving people lots of tips on how they can safely look out for each other, intervene, ways that community-based safety can be utilized to keep all of us safe.
Don't take drinks from strangers. Seriously. And
maybe don't go out alone. If you're going out, maybe go with a friend. Is that a helpful tip?
It definitely is when you can. It's not always an option for people. Again, sure. Are living in a day where many people are feeling isolated and they're going out for community. So it might not be an option for people, but yes, just, there's lots of tools that we have at our disposal. And I think, to Bee's point earlier, it's really important in these situations to make sure that we're in no way blaming the survivors and the victims in these circumstances, because they are obviously not at fault. Even if they didn't take all of our safety tips in mind, it's really important to make that clear so that survivors know that it's that, you deserve the support that you need. You deserve all of the resources, and you don't have to be ashamed, because there is a lot of shame that comes with these attacks and this violence. And if nothing else, that I think the anti-violence movement has been really good at is saying to people, this is not your problem. You are not at fault to blame, and you don't have to be ashamed of the violence that has happened to you.
So speaking of not doing things alone, Howard and Anthony, how did you assemble this team to put this thing together?
Yeah.
It was a big team.
It was a big team. We started, I'm sorry, hold on.
I'll go. It started with Story Syndicate bringing us in, and we worked with Story Syndicate to sort of assemble this this incredible team of people that Story Syndicate had worked with before, that Howard and I had been interviewing for months and figuring out who was the best to sort of join the team. And we did assemble a team of, I feel like, a lot of queer people that helped us in sort of figuring out the sensitivities, not only around the story, but in how we were interacting with each other as a team for 2 years, because it is such sensitive subject matter. It was also trying to create, this whole show. So it was a lot for all of us, and we were all sort of taking care of each other during the process of making it.
And in terms of like the origin of it, like it was interesting. Like me and Anthony and Story Syndicate and HBO were interested in telling the story, and then Matt Mayer and Charlize Theron at Denver and Delilah were also interested, and they have a deal with HBO. So it was kind of serendipity and synchronicity. So we all ended up doing it together. We set some parameters for HBO, and I think Anthony mentioned them earlier. We did not want to create anything that would re-traumatize the family members or victims, and we did not want to re-traumatize the community. And that meant the storytelling was going to reflect those like overall overarching principles. And HBO was very supportive of that. Because there have been other tellings of this story or these kinds of stories where those principles are not at play. And they're like, great.
I think also with true crime, with true crime, oftentimes the investigators and the detectives are the ones that are leading the narrative. But our whole ethos with this show was to let queer people really take control of the story and tell this story over 4 episodes, rather than giving the reins to detectives or investigators to really walk us through the story. I feel like we set that with HBO as like, we really wanted the queer community to be the ones driving this story.
And we needed a team that when you're doing outreach to people, whether it's subjects or, we'd reached out to AVP, to, Bev and Ori and your team there, to be able to look into your archives, and you were incredibly generous, but we had to like prove our intent, which we understand and sort of deliver on that, when we're making the show. And so, it just meant assembling an incredibly sensitive team to create the show.
Well, Howard and Anthony, you've both been involved in major productions about the community, How to Survive a Plague, the Pride series on Showtime. It was Showtime, wasn't it?
FX.
But those are very contemporary and uplifting stories. And I'm curious about how you sort of go backwards in time to a very dark subject matter, and how those play for you in your mindset.
I love that question. Nobody's asked us that question yet, actually.
Question. It's a really good
job,
question.
Howard.
Yeah.
As you know, as I know, from having been able to include you in so many projects. Look, I will say for myself, when I read the book and was thinking about the opportunity, and Anthony and I talked about this in terms of making the show, there was an opportunity to tell a story about the nature of violence and the nature of anti-violence. Where does this violence come from? What do you do to combat it? And those are hard stories to tell, but by telling them, it allows us to demystify and destigmatize, both for the past and for the present. And so it was very hard to live in those moments while we were telling, it was incredibly hard to live in those moments while we were telling the story, but we knew ultimately it was leading to a place of telling a story of resistance and community, which is not self-evident when reading the book, but was something that we wanted to create in making the show through the storytelling.
And we do step into present day, not to give too much away at the end of, in episode 4, but we really had to keep, I had to keep reminding myself that this is really a time capsule doc. So we are documenting the early 90s. We talked about the LGBTQ experience differently then. I had to keep reminding myself that we were really documenting a very specific time in queer history. Yeah, it was a constant, because I live in, a lot of my work lives in present day. I had to keep reminding myself that we were doing a very specific moment in queer history.
And in terms of reactions, I'm really curious. I know it's a television show and it's coming out on July 9th. That's when it's going to be on HBO and Max. But what, for, in terms of people who previewed it, this could be for anybody here, what kinds of different reactions are you getting from younger people, older people, LGBTQ, non-LGBTQ, mainstream, et cetera? What?
I mean, last night was incredible because we had such a wide range of people there. Anne, I tried to find you afterwards, and I was like, where is Anne? I was like sifting through the crowd to find you.
I was at Whole Foods.
Yeah, I figured something like that. But there was such a wide range of people there, and across the board, I was just blown away by the amount of love there was for this series, because it is difficult content in a way. It's hard to sit with. This is hard stuff to walk through and sit with. And I feel like everybody afterwards was so thrilled that this story was being told in this way. I think that was the first real reaction we got from a mass amount of people. And it was a lot of love and a lot of joy that this story was being told by queer people.
I started watching and it ended up couldn't stop watching, and I was up till 3 a.m. But what about B and Beverly? I know B, you've seen it. Beverly, you've seen it?
I haven't seen it yet.
Oh, you have something to look forward to.
I'm excited to hear what Beverly
thinks. This is making me think though about the parallels between then and now, and I'm hoping that as people watch it, they'll be able to. Yes. A lot of times we feel like we have to reinvent the wheel. There's so much that our community did back then that I think we can learn from. So I'm hoping that it has that feel to it as well.
And B, watching it?
Yeah, I mean, I watched it with a couple of my friends who are 2 gay men who are in their early 30s. And, I think for them, because they know me, they're like, how did you do all this and not talk about it, and I think I think for a larger queer, it felt like for me, like there's a lot of people in the queer community that aren't connected to the violence issue and don't want to be connected to the violence issue, and it forces people to do that in a way, and to face the reality that Matt talked about this, how one of the things that's common for us as queer people is our experiences with violence. And we tend to not want to look it in the face. And so it kind of forces us to do that, but in a way that is not isolating, but is connected to a whole of a community. And that, we come together because of love and because we want belonging. And it's a place for belonging, and that that's underlying, I think, the show, and I think underlying why like Bev and I do this work, and others who do this work.
that's a good place to end, unless anybody has a thought they want to get out before we end.
I just want to make the point that we're recording this on June 28th. We were at a screening of the first episode last night on the 27th, and that's why we're referring to last night when it's actually now a couple of weeks later.
Yes, that's a good point.
Well, we want to say thank you to NewFest, to HBO and Max for hosting. Remember to watch new episodes of Last Call on HBO Sundays at 9 Eastern and streaming on Max. Thanks for watching.
Thank
Thank
you
you
all.
all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.